us to, oh, it's being recorded. Great. It then transforms us to be like Jesus, to then be crucified in love, cruciform love, right? Is the keyword of today. Right. So we've talked about how the Eucharist, how we live a Eucharistic, like how do we become the Eucharist in our lives. Now we talk about how we become vital participants in the life of the church. So like I said at the start of the session, this is not a me and my sweet Jesus kind of session. It's really about going out. So actually, honestly, I thought that because I saw the title Eucharist, I was like, oh, we should just go for adoration, like what we did last month. But then when I read the chapter, I was like, actually, it's not really appropriate for today's session because again, it's not about me and my sweet Jesus. It's about being community and being participants. So, okay, so what does it mean to be part of the body of Christ? So we hear this a lot. We hear that St. Paul says that we are all part of the body of Christ. Like maybe you are the eye, you are ear, and the nose, the legs, that kind of thing. So, but what does it actually mean, right? So again, Ilia Delio tells us what it is not. So it is not being a passive listener. And being part of the body of Christ is not a mere affiliation. Yeah, it's not like, you see on your so you see in your official records, I'm Roman Catholic and therefore I'm part of the body of Christ. No, you also need to be active lovers and you need to participate. We need to be active lovers and we need to participate in the life of Christ. So it's really that participation that is key here and that active love. Yeah. So only the one who is on the path to God, who contemplates God and is then transformed by God, is truly a member of the church. It's a very tall order. I don't think the reason why I underline on the path is because it's a process. Like this is a journey. We're not required to already get there. I think we only get there when we die, and then a little bit more. But yeah. So it's actually as long as we are on the journey to God, which as a community we already are because that's our vision, right? To journey towards God. Yeah, the one who contemplates God, which we already do on Mondays, and we continue to do, and then we are transformed in God, and that's when we truly become a member of the church. And when the body of Christ becomes the body of the believer, then the body of the believer becomes the life of the church. So I'm sure you recognize this church, right? It's cathedral and it's empty. Yeah, this was a photo that was taken when they just finished renovating. The reason why I picked an empty church is because the church is not a building, it's not a venue. It's actually each and every one of us that make up the church, right? So the church on its own is not the body of Christ. It is the life of each of the believer that becomes then the body of Christ. Yeah. So there are a couple of quotes I want to refer to. So the first one is Albert Haas. Yes. Interesting title, Swimming in the Sun, Discovering the Lord's Prayer, Francis of Assisi and Thomas Merton. So he writes, we are the body of Christ on earth, and every day, in some way, shape, or form, we are challenged to become the bread that is broken for the hungry of the world. So I think what he focuses on is that we are the bread for the world. Like for those of us who in the world who cannot receive the body of Christ for whatever reason, then those of us who can then should become the bread for the world in the way that we live. Yeah. And Miroslav Volf also says, we would most profoundly misunderstand the Eucharist if we thought of it only as a sacrament of God's embrace, of which we are simply the fortunate beneficiaries. Inscribed on the very heart of God's grace is the rule that we can be its recipients only if we do not resist being made into its agents, and what happens to us must be done by us. Okay, so I really like this quote because actually it sums up the chapter. That the Eucharist is not just that person, it is that personal encounter with the Lord, but it's not just that. It's not just God's embrace of which we are recipients or we're the beneficiaries, right? Instead, it's that rule that not when we receive, we must then be what we have received. We must be the agents of what we have received. And so the Eucharist nourishes us and strengthens us, and then it empowers us to go out. And in a way, that is actually the structure of the Mass, right? That we come in, we receive the word, then we receive the Eucharist, and then we are sent forth. Because the Mass is actually in Latin is missa, which means sending forth. So we're not just meant to receive and then finish, but we go out as the body of Christ into the world. Yeah, to be the Eucharist for the world. So, oh no. Yes. Okay, so becoming the Eucharist is also embracing the total self-giving love of God. And we see that most in the cross. In the cross here in our context, obviously the San Damiano cross is the one that we're familiar with. So the cross reveals the total self-giving love of God that reaches out to estranged humanity and embraces every stranger as the beloved. It is not simply a being embraced by God, but an empowering of God's love by which we are to embrace others, including our enemies. So, the Eucharist tells us, or the Eucharist, becoming the Eucharist rather, requires us to also embody that self-giving love of God. Because how do we go into the world to be the body of Christ? We must then embody and have that self-giving love. Yeah. And that requires us going out to embrace every stranger as the beloved, in the way that Francis embraced the leper as beloved, or in the way that Clare embraced the sister who kicked her as beloved also. We must do the same. So you get kicked in the mouth, you just embrace your brother and sister. Yeah. Okay. And we also embrace our enemies, right? It's not just like it's not that you just love the ones who love you. You also have to love the ones that don't. Yeah. And the Eucharist signifies that each member is not external to other members, but internally related to the other members of the body of Christ. So we tend to see the other as outside of ourselves, as external to us, right? But the Eucharist tells us that to be the body of Christ, to really embrace that, is to see that we are actually one. We are all part of the same body. So the Eucharist means celebrating the gift of self given to the other and the receiving of the other into the self. I'm just going to pause here. It's actually a very difficult concept to swallow. Yeah. Especially, if we have been hurt by people around us, if, we find it difficult to love and to forgive, like even in your family, like in my family, for example, like I have a difficult relationship with my dad, right? Yeah, so I find it very hard to embrace him, but I'm sure we all have that struggle. Or like in your workplace, you receive a nasty email, like now in the outside of the world, we can think, oh, we will embrace our colleague, but actually when you read the email, like, I do not want to. There are many other things I will do rather than embrace you, but yet we are called to embrace the other, yeah, and to receive the other into ourselves. So difficult. And becoming the Eucharist also requires embracing suffering through the acceptance of others. Like I said, so like when you really try and give of yourself and receive the other, you become vulnerable. Yeah, so I think like Father Derek likes to say, like, vulnerable, the root word of vulnerable is vulnera, which means woundable, which means that you're actually woundable. Like when you open your heart, you become susceptible to pain, right? And also, yeah, so it does entail suffering. And in Clare's fourth letter to Agnes, she writes, all you who pass by the way, look and see if there's any suffering like my suffering. And from this moment, let yourself be inflamed more strongly with the fervor of charity. So if we are called to become the Eucharist, then we will have to embrace and bear the marks of the wounded Christ. Yeah. I guess no two ways about it. We just have to, that is what it means to be Eucharist. It's not some airy-fairy, beautiful, like unicorn fancy concept. It's actually a very painful, real reality that, we are called to embrace. And also, when we participate in the Eucharist, we accept weak and fragile humanity. It means that we are willing to put aside our boundaries of dislike, anger, hurt, jealousy, and whatever else may separate us and reach out in love. So like the picture, I don't know if you noticed. So actually here this person is crying, right? And then we reach out in love and like that. So in our lives, we may not want to live with a certain person, but in their own weak, frail humanity, as in ours, we then see the reflection of God's goodness. So this is not in the book, but when I was reading this part of the chapter, I thought about fratelli tutti, because actually that is quite similar to Pope Francis's exhortation to the church, right? Where he says, authentic reconciliation does not flee from conflict, but is achieved in conflict, resolving it through dialogue and open, honest, and patient negotiation. Conflict between different groups, if it abstains from enmities and mutual hatred, gradually changes into an honest discussion of differences founded on a desire for justice. Yeah, so it does require us to see each other as brother and sister, to see that the fraternity is not just here, but it's really the whole world, and to then put aside all of our defenses and boundaries to then reach out in love. Okay, so I'll just read a little bit from the book, right? Hang on. Okay, so there's this so we are close to the end of the chapter. Essentially, the other part of suffering and Eucharist is also that, something interesting that I like about this chapter is that she says that embracing suffering also takes the form of forgiveness. So we don't really think of forgiveness as suffering, but I guess, let's explore this together. So I'm going to read from this part of the book on page 91, where she relates the story of that Haas so Albert Haas recounts the story of Corrie ten Boom, who with her family was sent to the concentration camp at Ravensbrück for sheltering Jews. Only Corrie survived. After the war, she committed herself to lecturing on the topic of forgiveness and reconciliation. Haas writes, one day after giving her talk in Munich, Germany, a man came forward to thank her for her talk. Corrie couldn't believe her eyes. He was one of the Nazi guards who used to stand duty in the women's shower room at Ravensbrück. The man reached out to shake Corrie's hand, but she froze. After all her talks on forgiveness, she could not reach out her hand in friendship. Her physical body remembered too sharply the horror of the camp and the death of her beloved sister. Corrie was blocked emotionally, stuck in the crippling and debilitating rut of resentment, bitterness, hatred. As Corrie stood there, frozen with shock, the battle raged inside of her. She was torn between the seductive desire to balance the scales of justice with violence and revenge, and to heed Jesus' challenge of forgiveness, which she herself had preached so often. So she prayed silently to herself, Jesus, I cannot forgive this man. Give me your forgiveness. And as she prayed that prayer, and as her mind's eye reviewed the years of brutality, suffering, humiliation, death, her hand suddenly lifted from her side. This former prisoner found herself offering the former shower guard the one thing she thought she did not know how to give. I forgive you, my brother, with all my heart. So the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer says that forgiveness is a form of suffering because you are denying the desire for revenge. So let's take a moment now to think of somebody you find it very hard, have not been able to forgive for a while, right? And you see this person in front of you, much like how the story in the book talks about, Corrie sees the oppressor in front of her, like, in our own lives, we also have our own, right? So you see this person in front of you and the person is like, please forgive me. Will you really go and immediately reach out and, like, from the goodness of your heart say, oh, I forgive you 100%, and then you can go straight to heaven? No, it doesn't work that way, right? It's because, each of us, we carry that brokenness and that anger and hurt, and when we see the person that has caused us all of that, you can't help but feel like, I want to take my revenge. But forgiveness is really suppressing and putting that aside, and instead embracing love. And Beatrice Ruteau also says that this intensified giving, which gives itself away, is the heart of agape. Because that is exactly what Jesus did on the cross, right? He put aside any desire for revenge. He put aside any desire to give harsh words to his oppressor, to threaten them. But instead, he tells the Father, like, forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they're doing. Yeah, so it's truly the heart of God when we forgive. And each act of forgiveness is a new act of creation where we allow ourselves to let go so that the God of humble love may enter in. Because when we really find it in ourselves to forgive someone, then it transforms us as well. Because then, we're not holding on to that grudge or that resentment, or letting go, and that gives space for light and love to then enter. But forgiveness is hard. We're not required to do so on our own strength. And instead, the act of forgiveness must be nurtured by grace and strengthened by love, because it requires self-transcendence. Yeah, it really requires you to step out of yourself and to really do something that's unimaginable. But that's where when we call on the Lord to give us his forgiveness, then we can do the unimaginable and transcend. Yeah. So to close, essentially Saint Teresa, or in this prayer attributed to Saint Teresa, she talks about how Christ has no body but yours, no hands but yours, no feet but yours. Yours are the eyes through which must look out Christ for compassion on the world. So when we talk about Eucharist, it's not just, a piece of bread. It's obviously not a piece of bread. It's not just receiving the body of Christ, but it's how we then become and embody that body of Christ to the world. Yeah. In summary, Clare's spiritual path calls for active love, not being a passive recipient, but being an active lover. And in contemplation, only one who has entered into union with the crucified spouse can transform, can become like the spouse, crucified in love. And then, the church lives and grows when its members are active lovers. And so the body of Christ is life for the world, and we are invited into this sacred banquet of life. Yes. So, some time for reflection before we break out into our sharing groups. There are questions from the book. If you want to share more about forgiveness and how does the Eucharist help you live in the spirit of reconciliation and forgiveness, that's good too. Or if you want to talk about how you want to reflect on how, what does the Eucharist mean to you, do so as well, or anything that struck you from the chapter, or even the stories that were told in today's chapter, which are quite a lot actually. So so it'll take some time for reflection. It's now 8:48, so we take until 8:55. 8:55? Okay, then we'll come back. See you later.